In the high lonesome country above Cripple Creek, in the Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1881, there stood a strip of canvas and rotted pole that the camp called nothing at all. It had belonged to a dead man, and dead men in a mining camp own nothing but the space their bodies last took up. The tent leaned against a granite shoulder where the road bent toward the played-out claims, sun-bleached to the gray of old bone, its ridge sagging where the snow of 3 winters had pressed it down. Nobody wanted it. A woman of 20 bought it for $1, and the men who watched her count the coin out laughed, because they believed she had bought a hole in the ground with a roof over it. She had been turned out of her uncle's house 11 days before with a carpet bag, a dead woman's sewing kit, and a single iron tool wrapped in oilcloth. Her name was Hannah Reese, and she had no people left who would claim her. What she did have, the camp did not yet know, was a pair of hands that had been taught to read the ground the way other people read a printed page. Keep her in your mind as the canvas comes down. She is the whole of the story, and the ground beneath that tent is about to tell her something no living man in Cripple Creek had ever bothered to ask it. The man who sold her the tent was the camp clerk, a thin person named Durbin, who kept the ledgers for the Banner Consolidated Company and wore sleeve garters even in the cold. He had crossed the dead miner's name out of the book that morning and was glad to be rid of the bother. The miner had been an old Welshman called Price, who died in his sleep, with no kin and no will, owing the company's store $4.60. Durbin sold the tent to settle what he could of the debt, and $1 was the best bid the camp offered. A teamster had laughed and said she would do better to buy a grave and have done, since the tent and the grave came to about the same comfort. 2 other men laughed with him. Durbin took Hannah's coin without looking at her face, entered the dollar against the dead man's debt in a hand that did not hurry, and told her the rest would be written off as a loss. To him she was a line to be entered and forgotten, and the tent a thing he was relieved to strike from his count. Hannah did not argue the price up or down. She had learned long ago that the people who underestimate you will hand you things they would guard from a person they respected, and a tent nobody valued was a roof she could afford. She carried her bag up the bend in the road and stood before the leaning canvas in the last of the light. The wind came down off the bare peaks and worked at the loose flaps, and the whole structure breathed like something tired. She did not see a hovel. She saw a place a man had lived alone for a long time, and she had learned that a man who lives alone leaves the truth of himself in the floor he stands on. Her teaching had come from a grandfather she had buried 2 springs back, a man named Eli who had spent his life as an assayer and a well digger across 3 territories before his knees gave out. Eli Reese had no patience for talk and a great deal of patience for stone. He had taught her to test ground by its weight and its color and its smell, to know caliche from clay, to know which silence in a shovel stroke meant rock and which meant a buried thing. The iron tool in her oilcloth was his sounding bar, a 4-foot length of forged steel with a worn-round handle and a chisel point, and it was the only inheritance he left that the law allowed her to keep. Her uncle had taken the rest. The bar he had not wanted because he did not know what it was for. That first night she slept in the dead man's tent with her shawl pulled to her chin and the sounding bar laid across her knees, and she listened. A person can learn a great deal about a place by lying still in it. She heard the canvas crack and the wind in the bristlecone above the rock, and under all of it a faint and steady sound she could not name, a sound like a slow heartbeat coming up through the packed dirt where the dead man had set his cot. She put her bare palm flat against the floor of the tent and felt nothing but cold. The sound stayed with her even so, and she did not sleep much, and when the gray came, she was already kneeling on the ground with her ear pressed to the dirt like a doctor listening at a chest. Eli had taught her that the ground has more than one voice, and that the trick of it is to learn which voice belongs to the wind and the weather and the camp above, and which belongs to the earth itself. The heartbeat she had heard, she decided by morning, was no fancy of a frightened woman in a strange place. It was the wind finding a hollow somewhere beneath her, and breathing across the mouth of it the way breath crosses the neck of a jug and makes a low note. She had heard that note before. As a girl, the day Eli found a forgotten cistern under a barn floor in the Nebraska country by the sound it made when the wind moved right. A hollow under packed ground, he had told her, is most often a thing somebody made on purpose, because nature fills its own hollows in with water and time. She lay on her side in the cold and looked at the dead man's swept patch of earth, and understood that someone had once dug into it and covered the digging over, and that the wind had been trying to tell her so all night. The camp woke around her without noticing her. Cripple Creek in that autumn was a raw place of 900 souls strung along a gulch, all of them chasing gold that the big company had mostly already taken from the easy veins. Banner Consolidated owned the good claims, the stamp mill, the store, and the assay scale, and what Banner did not own it could afford to ignore. A woman in a dead man's tent was beneath ignoring. She drew water from the public barrel, and a man named Toomey, who ran the livery, watched her and said she would freeze before the first hard snow, and might as well go down to Florence while the road held. She thanked him for the warning. She did not tell him she had no intention of leaving the spot where the ground had spoken to her in the night. What Hannah did over the next several days looked to the camp like a poor woman tidying a hovel she was too proud to abandon. She took the canvas down entirely, folded it, and stacked the rotted poles to one side. She swept the bare rectangle of earth the tent had covered, a patch perhaps 12 feet by 9, packed hard and dark from years of a man's boots. Then she walked it. She walked it slow, heel to toe, the sounding bar held loose in her right hand, and every third or fourth step she lifted the bar and brought its chisel point down against the ground. Not hard, just enough to listen to what came back. Eli had called it knocking on the door of the earth. Most of the floor answered the same dull way. Near the head of where the cot had stood, though, in a space the width of 2 hands, the bar came back with a different voice, a hollow ring that traveled up the steel and into her wrist and told her plainly that the dirt there was lying. She knelt and worked her fingers into the packed surface and found, under a 1/4 inch of trodden dust, the edge of a board, not a floorboard, for the tent had no floor. A board laid flat into the earth and covered over its grain, run through with the gray of long burial. She did not dig it up. She had been taught that the first thing you find is rarely the thing that matters, and a person who tears at the ground in excitement destroys the very order that would tell her the truth. Instead, she marked the corners of the hollow place with 4 small stones, covered the board again with its dust, and sat back on her heels to think. The sound in the night had not been her fancy. Something beneath the dead man's bed had been waiting a long time to be heard. That evening, Durbin came up the road on the company's business, which was to tell her she could not keep a fire where she was, because the tent that had stood there was now company scrap, and the ground was company ground. Hannah listened to him with her hands folded. She asked him in a level voice who had surveyed the claim the tent stood on, and whether the old Welshman had held it or merely squatted on it. Durbin told her the ground was Banner ground, surveyed and recorded, and that Price had been allowed to die on it as a kindness. Then he told her she had until the snow to move along. She said she understood. She did not tell him about the board, and she watched him walk back down toward the lit windows of the camp with the particular care of a woman who has decided not to trust a man, and has not yet decided how much that distrust will cost her. The old Welshman, she learned over the following days, had not always been a charity case dying in a leaning tent. She learned it from a woman named Sutter who took in washing and remembered more than the camp gave her credit for. Price had come into the district in the early days, Sutter said, before Banner Consolidated had a single building, when the gulch was free ground and a man with a strong back could record his own claim at the county seat down in Cajon City. He had worked a good claim once up near where the company's number 4 shaft now stood, and he had talked in his cups of having recorded it proper, papered and witnessed, years before the company came. Then the company came, and the paper meant nothing, and Price ended his days owing $4.60 to the store that stood on ground he once swore was his. Sutter said it the way old women say things they have stopped expecting anyone to act upon. Hannah turned that over while she worked. She did not yet see the whole shape of it, but she saw the edges, the way she could see the edge of the buried board. A man who recorded a claim proper does not become a pauper on his own ground unless someone made him one. And the someone in a camp like this would not have done it with a gun. He would have done it with paper, with a ledger, with a scale that read light, with a surveyor's chain that stretched a few links long in the company's favor. Eli had told her once that the worst thieves he ever knew never lifted a thing heavier than a pen, and that the ground they stole always remembered what the paper forgot. She had not understood him fully as a girl. She was beginning to understand him now. She came to the board on the 4th morning, and she came to it the way Eli had taught her, slow and in order. She lifted the dust, then the board, easing it up by its edges so the dirt that had held it kept the shape of where it lay, and found beneath it not treasure, but a second thing, a flat tin box of the kind that holds tobacco, its lid rusted shut and its seams gone, the orange of old iron. She did not pry it open in the field. She carried it to the rock face out of the wind, set it on her knee, and worked the lid with the thinnest blade of the dead woman's sewing kit, patient as picking a knot, running the steel around the seam a hair at a time so the rust gave instead of tearing, until the lid came up with the small sound of a thing sealed a long time letting go its held breath. A breath of cold air came out of it that had been shut inside for 9 years, and she smelled wax and old metal, and the faint must of paper kept dry. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper gone brittle, was a folded document and a smaller paper, and a short length of brass chain with a tag stamped in numbers she could read by tilting it to the light. The document was a claim record. It carried the seal of Fremont County, the date of registration 9 years before Banner Consolidated filed its first paper in the district, and the name, in a clerk's careful hand, of David Price. It described, in the chains and the bearings of a proper survey, the very ground on which the company's number 4 shaft now stood, the richest producing shaft in the gulch. The smaller paper was a surveyor's field note, signed and witnessed, recording the original corners. And the brass chain with its numbered tag was a survey chain seal, the kind a county surveyor crimped to his chain to prove it had not been tampered with, stamped with a number that could be checked against the county's own record of which chains it had certified. Hannah sat very still with the cold box on her knee. She understood that she was holding the proof of a theft committed with paper, buried by a dishonored man under his own bed so that it could not be taken from him a second time, kept against a day when someone might come who knew how to read it. She did not run down the hill shouting. The camp would not have believed a woman in a dead man's tent, and Banner Consolidated would have found a way to lose the box before any honest eye saw it. She had learned, lying still in the night, that the truth keeps better in the dark a while longer than it does in a careless light. So she wrapped the document again, and the field note and the brass seal, and she put them not back under the board but inside her own dress against her skin, and she covered the empty hollow over so that anyone who came looking would find only disturbed dirt and a poor woman's leavings. Then she walked down into the camp as if nothing had changed, and she began quietly to find out who in Cripple Creek would know an honest survey from a crooked one. The man she found was named Abram Castle, and he was old, and he had been the county's own surveyor in the years before Banner came, put out of his post when the company's money reached the county seat. He lived now in a cabin below the gulch with a bad hip and a great store of bitterness, and he did not at first want to talk to her. You will want to know whether anyone in that camp helped her, whether she carried this alone. She did not carry it alone, but she carried the weight of it alone. And that is a different thing. Castle let her in because she carried a sounding bar, and a man who has spent his life with instruments knows another person who respects them by the way they hold one. She set the brass seal on his table without a word. He picked it up, held it to the window light, read the number, and his hands began to shake. He set it down and picked it up again as if he did not trust his own eyes. And then he told her in a voice gone thin that he had crimped that very seal to his own chain in the spring of 1870, and that the chain it certified had measured David Price's claim true. He had thought the seal lost to the world. He had thought, some nights, that he had dreamed the whole honest measurement of that ground, so completely had the company's paper buried it. What Castle told her over the next hour filled in the shape she had only seen the edges of. Banner Consolidated had not discovered the number 4 vein. It had taken it. When the company came into the district with capital and lawyers, it had filed claims over ground already held by single men too poor to fight, and where a man like Price held a recorded title that could not simply be ignored, the company had arranged for the original survey to be declared faulty, the corners mismeasured. A new survey, paid for by Banner and sworn by a man the company kept, had moved the corners just enough to swallow Price's claim into the company's patent. The old record had been called a clerical error and quietly retired. Price had spent the last of his money fighting it in a court that the company's money had already reached, and he had lost, and he had buried the only proof that the first survey was sound, because the proof itself, the certified chain seal, had vanished from the county's evidence the day before his hearing. Vanished, Castle said, because someone had stolen it. He had always believed Price took it. To keep it safe, he had never known where. Hannah asked him the only question that mattered. She asked whether the county still held the record of which numbered seals it had certified, the master book against which this brass tag could be matched, or whether that too had been made to disappear. Castle said the book had been in the courthouse at Coyon City, and that he did not know if it still was, for the company's reach was long and 9 years was time enough to lose a great many inconvenient pages. He looked at the seal in his hand and said that if the certifying book survived, then this small piece of crimped brass was worth more than the number 4 shaft itself, because it would prove the company's whole patent rested on a survey it had bought, and every dollar of gold taken from that shaft belonged in law and in justice to the estate of a man buried in a pauper's grave above the camp. Then he set the seal down, very gently, the way a man sets down something he is afraid to break, and he said that no honest court in the territory had been able to touch Banner Consolidated in 9 years. She did not let that be the end of it. She had not been raised to believe that a wrong was safe merely because it was old and rich. She had been raised to be careful, though, and she understood that she now held a thing the company would burn the courthouse to destroy if it knew the thing existed. So she did 3 things, in order the way Eli had taught her to do anything that mattered. First, she kept the seal and the papers on her body and told no one but Castle what she had. Second, she learned everything she could about who still lived, who had been wronged alongside Price, so that the truth, when it came out, would not be a curiosity about a dead Welshman, but a reckoning for the living. Third, she went on living quietly in the cleared ground above the camp, a poor woman waiting out the season while the company clerk, Durbin, watched her now and then and saw nothing worth a second look. It was Castle who told her about the granddaughter. David Price had a daughter once, who had married and gone east before the trouble, and that daughter had borne a child and died, and the child, a young woman now, had written to Castle 2 years back, asking after her grandfather's grave because no one else in the world remembered him. Her name was Mary Lowe, and she worked in a mill town in the Kansas country, and she did not know that the ground her grandfather died beside had made other men rich. Hannah understood at once that Mary Lowe was the still point. The whole matter turned on. A dead man's claim is an abstraction that a court can mislay. A living granddaughter with a name and a face standing in a courtroom holding her grandfather's certified survey is a thing far harder to make disappear. She wrote to Mary Lowe that night by the light of a fire she was forbidden to keep, and she chose her words with great care because she was about to ask a stranger to come a long way toward a wound. The first snow came before any answer could. It came the way snow comes in that high country, without much warning. A gray morning that thickened to white by noon and buried the gulch by dark. And Hannah, who had no tent now and only the rock face and a lean-to of the rotted poles she had saved, came nearer to dying that week than she let herself think about afterward. She had banked the poles against the granite shoulder and stretched the folded canvas over them and weighted the edges with stones, and it was not a shelter so much as an argument against the wind, and the wind won a little more of it each hour. She kept the fire small and constant. She kept the papers dry against her skin. She melted snow in a tin and ate little and slept less, waking each time the fire dropped to feed it another splinter of the dead man's poles, until she was burning the very wood that had once held the canvas over Price's head. On the third night of it, when the cold had got so deep into her that her hands would not close, she held the sounding bar across her knees, and remembered Eli in his last winter, sitting by a stove with his ruined knees wrapped, telling her that the ground does not hurry, and neither should the person who means to learn from it. He had said it about digging, but she understood now that it was about waiting too, about the long patience that is the only thing the poor have more of than the rich. She thought of David Price lying in this same wind, 9 winters running, an old man who knew the truth and could not make anyone hear it, keeping his small fire and his buried proof and his silence. She thought that she would not let his patience have been for nothing. The thought was warmer than the fire, and she lived on it. She did not freeze. The snow broke on the 5th day, and the world came back blinding white and silent. And Toomey, from the livery, who had told her she would die, came up the road on a mule that floundered to its chest in the drifts, with a sack of cornmeal and a side of bacon lashed behind the saddle. He set them down without quite meeting her eye, and said the camp had taken a notion that a woman who would not be run off ought at least not to starve. She thanked him plainly. She did not weep, though something in her chest moved, because she had learned that gratitude shown too large makes a proud man wish he had not come. He looked at her lean-to and her small fire and the swept ground beyond it, and he asked her what she was digging for up here, and she told him she was not digging for anything, she was listening, and he went away down the white road shaking his head at a kind of work he had no name for. She understood that the camp's contempt had begun very slightly to turn. Mary Lowe's answer reached Cripple Creek in the last week of the year, carried up from the Florence post by a freighter who could not read the name and asked 3 people before he found her. Hannah opened it with hands that still did not work quite right from the cold. Mary Lowe would come in the spring. When the passes cleared, she had her grandmother's letters. She had, she wrote, always been told that her grandfather had been a failure who lost everything to drink and bad luck, and she wanted, more than she could say, to know if that was a lie. Hannah read the letter twice and then sat looking at the white peaks for a long while. She had set something in motion now that she could not call back. A young woman was going to cross half the plains on the strength of a stranger's word and a brass seal dug from under a dead man's bed. And if Hannah had read the ground wrong, she would have brought that woman all that way to a second grief. She had not read it wrong. While the snow held the high country shut, Hannah made the slow journey down to Cajon City herself, on foot to where the road cleared, and then by a freighter's empty wagon that carried her the last day for the price of riding silent, carrying the seal but not the papers, which she left with Castle against the chance that she did not come back. The freighter, a close-mouthed man hauling timber, asked her no questions, and she offered him none, and they passed the long, cold miles watching the peaks lower into foothills. The courthouse at the county seat was a square stone building that smelled of cold ink and old paper, and she stood in its doorway a moment, brushing the road dust from her shawl, aware that a poor woman could be turned out of such a place as easily as out of a house. She was not turned out. The clerk who kept the records was a young man with no stake in Banner Consolidated and no reason to lie to a quiet woman who asked politely to see the surveyor's certification book for the year 1870. He brought it down from a high shelf, blew the dust from its top edge, and set it before her, and she turned the pages slowly, her cold fingers careful of the brittle paper, until she found the spring of that year, and the column of numbered seals the county had certified. There, in faded ink in a clerk's hand 9 years dead, was the number stamped on the brass tag against her skin. She read it 3 times, to be certain her wanting it had not made her see it. The book had survived. Whatever the company had reached, it had not reached this high shelf in this cold room, because no one had ever imagined a poor woman would come asking for a number she should not have known to want. She kept her face still and her voice level, and only her hands, flat on the open page, knew what the moment was. She copied the entry in her own hand and had the young clerk witness the copy and seal it with the county's stamp, paying the lawful fee of 50 cents for a certified transcript, which was the second dollar she had spent in the whole affair, and bought a thing worth more than the first dollar by an amount she could not yet count. Then she went home to the high country to wait for spring and for Mary Lowe, carrying in her satchel the certified proof that the seal was real, the seal that proved the chain was true, the chain that proved the survey was sound, the survey that proved the claim was Price's, and the claim that proved the number 4 shaft and 9 years of its gold belonged to a dead man's only living kin. The proof was a chain of small, honest things, each one verifiable, none of it depending on her word or anyone's memory. That was how Eli had taught her to build a truth. You did not shout it. You assembled it piece by piece until it could stand on its own without you. Spring came late and hard, and Mary Lowe came with it, a slight young woman with her grandfather's wide-set eyes, stepping down from the Florence stage with one trunk and a face that did not know whether to hope. Hannah met her at the road. She did not embrace her, for they were strangers, but she took the trunk and carried it, and she walked Mary Lowe up the gulch to the cleared ground above the camp and showed her the rectangle of swept earth where her grandfather had slept his last winters, and the hollow under the head of the cot where he had buried the only thing he had left to leave her. Mary Lowe stood looking at the small, bare patch for a long moment. This poor strip of mountain that was all the world had told her of the old man, and then she knelt in the dirt and put her hand flat against the cold ground, and Hannah, who had done the same thing on her first night here, said nothing and let her. The wind came down off the peaks the way it always had. After a while, Mary Lowe stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt and said, in a steady voice, that she was ready to hear the rest. Then they went down to Abram Castle's cabin, and the old surveyor laid out the document and the field note and the brass seal and Hannah's certified transcript on his table, and he explained to David Price's granddaughter, in plain words, that her grandfather had not been a failure. He had been robbed, and the proof of it had been under his bed the whole 9 years, waiting for a hand that knew how to listen for it. The undoing of Banner Consolidated did not happen in a single dramatic hour, and Hannah never wished it had. It happened the way honest things happen, slowly and through proper channels, and it was the more complete for being slow. Castle knew a lawyer in Denver who had no love for the company and a long memory, and the lawyer came down to Sanyan City and examined the chain of proof and found it sound. Every link of it, the certified transcript matching the seal matching the field note matching the original recorded claim. All of it predating the company's patent by 9 years and exposing the company's own survey as the bought and crooked thing it was. The lawyer filed on behalf of the estate of David Price with Mary Lowe as his heir, and the company's lawyers came with all their money and all their practice delay, and it availed them nothing, because the proof did not argue. It simply was. A survey chain certified by the county in 1870 cannot be made to have not existed by any amount of money once the book that certified it has been found. Durbin the clerk was the one who came up the road to learn what she had done near the end of it, when the company had begun to understand that the ground under its richest shaft was not its own. He found Hannah sitting on the rock above the cleared earth, with a sounding bar across her knees, and he stood at a little distance and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, which in a sense he was. He asked her in a voice that had lost its sleeve-guarded certainty how she had known. She told him the truth, because she had no reason to lie and no wish to gloat. She told him a dead man had buried a thing under his bed, and the ground had told her where, because she had been taught to ask it. Durbin had no answer to that. He went back down the road, and within the year he had left the district, and the company that had been Banner Consolidated was broken up and sold for its debts, its patent on the number 4 shaft voided, and Hannah did not go to watch any of it happen. She had not done it to watch men fall. She had done it because a wrong, once you have read it plainly in the ground, cannot be unread, and a person who can read it and does nothing becomes a part of it. The gold that had been taken could not all be given back, for much of it was 9 years spent and gone into the world. The shaft and the claim and the unmined ground did return to the estate, and the court ordered an accounting of what had been taken, and Mary Lowe, who had come west believing her grandfather a drunkard and a fool, went home a woman of means with her grandfather's name cleared in the record of the county. She did not keep all of it. On Hannah's advice, given quietly and only once, she set aside a portion to settle the small old debts the camp's poorest had carried for years on the company's books, the $4 here and the 60 cents there, the kind of debt that had once let the company call a robbed man a pauper. It was not a grand gesture, and the newspapers did not write of it. It was restitution, which is a quieter thing than triumph, and lasts longer. Mary Lowe wanted to give Hannah money, and Hannah would not take it, and this was not pride, but something Eli had put in her that she could not have unlearned if she tried. She had not dug up the proof to make herself rich on another woman's inheritance. She took one thing only when Mary Lowe pressed her, and it was the brass survey seal, the small crimped tag that had started it all, because Castle said the law no longer needed it once the transcript stood certified, and because Hannah wanted one true object to keep against the years. She strung it on a thong and did not wear it for show. She kept it in the same oilcloth as the sounding bar, the inheritance she had been given and the inheritance she had earned, lying together. She did not leave Cripple Creek. The camp that had laughed at her dollar grew used to her, and then, in the slow way of such places, came to rely on her. When a man bought a claim he could not read, he climbed the gulch to ask the woman with the sounding bar to walk it for him and tell him whether the ground was lying. When the new survey of the district was made fair, this time the young county clerk who had found her the book sent word that her certified transcript had become part of the permanent record, the small honest paper that had undone 9 years of a bought one. Toomey at the livery, who had once told her she would freeze, kept a stall for her mule without charge and would not discuss it. The camp had proven her right by needing her, which is the only vindication that ever lasts, and she never once said that she had told them so, because she had not told them anything. She had only listened to the ground and reported what it said. Years went by in that high country, more than she had thought she would see when she came up the road with a carpet-bag and $1. Mary Lowe wrote at Christmas every year and named her first daughter Hannah, and the woman in the gulch kept the letters in the tin tobacco box that had held the proof, which she had cleaned of its rust and kept for the purpose, so that the box that had hidden the truth now held the record of what the truth had set right. She grew older walking the ground for other people. reading its lies and its silences, teaching one or two who had the patience to learn the way she had been taught, that the earth keeps an honest account when men do not, and gives it up to the hand that knows how to knock. On a clear autumn evening near the end of her long life, with the aspens gone gold along the gulch and the bare peaks already white, she sat where the dead man's tent had stood, on ground that was hers now by lawful purchase and long use, and she took the sounding bar from its oilcloth and set its worn handle in her palm, the way Eli had taught her when she was a girl who owned nothing. The brass seal lay beside it, green now with age, but its numbers still readable to anyone who tilted it to the light. She did not knock on the ground that evening. There was nothing left under it that she needed to ask. She only held the old iron a while and watched the light go off the peaks and let the quiet have her. A woman who had been thrown out at 20 with $1 and a tool, and who had learned that the cheapest thing in a camp full of gold can be the one that holds the truth, if only someone troubles to listen. Have you ever held a small, worthless-seeming thing that turned out to carry more weight than anyone around you could see? Stay with these stories of the frontier and of the patient hands that brought its buried truths to light.